Right now on Upfront.
The new court.
To the best of my ability.
Congratulations.
Susan Crawford sworn in as the next justice on the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
I'm ready to get to work.
The court's liberal majority solidified. The new case is now just weeks away after the most expensive state court race in the nation's history. With us this Sunday, sitting Justice Brian Hagedorn, a member of the court's conservative minority. Hagedorn on the new court, the money, and politics. We'll get to it all.
Then toss-up.
Well, I think we've got the right candidate.
A week after Democratic Governor Tony Evers announced he won't seek re-election, the quickly emerging Democratic primary.
So yeah, I think a robust primary is good.
Now the change in the race for governor. Kyle Kondik with Sabato's crystal ball here to break it all down.
And showtime, the new tax incentives to make movies right here in Wisconsin. Filmmaker and UW professor Aaron Greer with what it all means.
This is Upfront with Jaron Jordan and political director Matt Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The new court is here just weeks now from the first set of oral arguments. Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Susan Crawford sworn in Friday during a ceremony at the state capitol.
Chief Justice Jill Karofsky delivering the oath. Crawford's victory over conservative Brad Schimel in April cemented the court's 4-3 liberal majority.
From the beginning, this court has stepped up in the moments that matter most. It has taken seriously its duty to interpret our Constitution and protect the rule of law, even when the issues were politically charged, deeply divisive, or hard to untangle. That's always been the job, and it still is today. I'm proud to take my seat on this court, and I'm ready to meet this moment. And most of all, that means I'm ready to get to work for the people of our great state on Wisconsin. Thank you.
With that, let's bring in Supreme Court Justice Brian Hagedorn. Justice, good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you.
You are considered a member of the court's conservative minority. You have made a point, I've noticed, to attend a lot of the events of some of your liberal colleagues, whether it's Susan Crawford's swearing in, Justice Protasiewicz, and Walsh Bradley's retirement. Some of the other conservative colleagues have not. Has that been intentional on your end to show up to some of these events?
Well, we're one court, and so I think it's important for me to support my colleagues. And the people of Wisconsin elect who the members of the court are going to be. So I think it's appropriate and right to be there, and that's a decision that I make and try to work around that. So yeah, I think it is an intentional effort to be there and support my colleagues.
In this most recent term that wrapped up, we saw some pretty high-profile decisions from the court, including on the state's abortion cases. We saw the cases really determining the power of the legislature and the governor as well. Some of those decisions unanimous, others split along the conservative and liberal lines. How divided is this court? What would you say at this moment?
Well, you make an interesting point. I mean, I think some people have this idea that 7 members of the court get together in a room, they decide what they want the outcome of a case to be, and then rejigger the law to be that. And that's not the case most of the time. I mean, every member of this court really does, I think, try to take the law seriously. And so we've had some surprising unanimity, I think, as you've seen, that maybe members of the public didn't like. And I think that's a really positive thing. We saw, for example, Governor Evers tried to expand sort of the scope of when he gets to use the partial veto powers. And the court unanimously, an opinion by Justice Rebecca Bradley, said no, that wasn't right. And the legislature passed some laws attempting to give itself some power over litigation, and the court unanimously said no in an opinion that I wrote. So I think those things are really encouraging. There obviously are differences in judicial philosophy, and there are times when there are strong disagreements, and you see that come out in our writings. And so when there are, we say so.
In terms of some of these unanimous decisions, are there moments where the justices themselves are surprised that all 7 of you agreed on this?
Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. But I do think it's something that, we worked for this term. I mean, certainly when you have these cases, you try to talk it through and think it through. And again, I think that's an encouraging thing. And I hope to see more and more of that. Not that we need to agree on everything. I mean, disagreement is fine, right? I mean, we will exercise our judgment to disagree on things. And in some cases, we do have different judicial philosophies where some have a maybe more expansive view of the judicial role than others, or how we read statutes. And that's going to play itself out. But I think we're all trying to do our level best to apply the law most of the time.
You say that the disagreement is healthy among the justices. I'm just curious, going back to the court division question just really quickly, what would you say to critics who say that the court is so divided that it's just become too political?
Well, there's something to that. I mean, the court has been in some state of dysfunction for 30 years. I mean, just to call it straight. And from the time I clerked on the court to the time I've watched the court to the time I've been on it, there have been clashes of personality and others that have, I think, hindered the work of the court. And so it's incumbent upon us, the 7 of us, to work together. We don't serve the people well if our disagreements are not professional. We don't serve the people well if we allow politics or personal views or disagreements or personality conflicts to drive our decisions. So, and again, this far predates any member, almost any member of the court that this has been going on. So it's a culture issue. And so are there things that we're doing really well? Yes. Are there ways we need to improve? Absolutely. And I think it's incumbent upon us as the court to earn the people's trust that what we are doing is law, that we're conducting ourselves as professionals.
We're coming off of 2 of the most expensive court races in the nation's history right here in Wisconsin. Our editorial partners, WisPolitics. Final tally of the most recent race in April with Susan Crawford. Final tally nearly $115 million. Is this the new normal?
Probably. And I think what's interesting about this is money is a proxy for value, right? So you trade money for things that you value, whether it's a family vacation or a car or a house. But people also think they're getting something of value when they donate to candidates. And it makes sense when you're donating to a governor's race or a legislative race because they're running on policy issues. So I think it is real cause for concern. The money, to me, is less of the problem. The question is, why do people think this is a good use of their money? What do they think they're getting from this court? And the reality is, I think it is, in many respects, a vote of no confidence in this court, that this court is not going to be a place that's just going to apply the law, at least all 7 of us. And people can disagree why and who, okay? Because it's both sides that are pouring money into these races. But people increasingly see this court and courts around the country as an extension of the political branches. And it's incumbent upon us to prove them wrong, to disabuse them of that notion. So people think they're getting something for that. And by the way, that's not a comment upon any of the current members of the court, that they're necessarily trying to fulfill a promise. I'm not speaking ill of my colleagues in any way, any of them. I'm talking about what people want out of their court and want out of Supreme Court justices. Something's deeply wrong when that kind of money is going into a state Supreme Court race.
Is that panning out, though? Are Democrats getting what they want from the liberal justices and Republicans getting what they want from the conservative justices?
I think the people of Wisconsin need to make that judgment. And more than that, I think the people of Wisconsin need to ask themselves whether that's what they want out of a court. Are we just supposed to be an extension of political branches?
Does that bother you when you see numbers like that? A vast majority of voters want you to discuss the issues?
I don't know. It bothers me more that I think many citizens don't want judges to be judges. They want them to be extensions of their political views. And we need to resist that, I think, as a people.
I'm curious, 6 years into your term, what do your conservative supporters think of you?
Well, I guess it was probably about 7 years ago when I launched my campaign, and I said I was going to be a judicial conservative, that I was going to be a textualist and originalist who applies the law as written, that I was going to understand that I have a modest role as a member of the judiciary, not inserting myself into everything, that I was going to operate without fear or favor to anyone, and I was going to be fiercely independent. So I've kept those promises, and I hear a lot of encouraging words around the state from people of all political stripes.
And you've made some conservatives mad as well along the way.
Any good justice will.
As you look ahead, this is several years out, do you plan on seeking another term as a justice?
Well, like I said, I'm proud of my record and proud of where I stand at the moment. I'm inclined to, but we've got 3 important races between now and then. So, like I said, I've kept my promises. I'm proud of the work that I've done. I think if you ask people in the legal community, they know I write really clear and good opinions. And anybody who appears before me know that I'm persuadable on the law. And if there's anything that I could say as a compliment to the work I do, it's hopefully that people know that they come appear before me, they're going to get somebody who takes their arguments seriously. It doesn't matter whether they're on the right or on the left, whether they're an interest group, an average citizen, a pro se prisoner, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna follow the law, and I'm gonna do so faithfully, and I'll continue to do that.
Just weeks away from a new round of oral arguments, Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Brian Hagedorn. Justice, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Our recent interview with now retired Justice Ann Walsh Bradley you can watch on the WISN 12 YouTube page. Just look for and subscribe to the Upfront playlist.
Coming up, the race for governor, Democratic Governor Tony Evers weighing in days after announcing he won't seek re-election. Now the race a toss-up. Kyle Kondik with Sabato's Crystal Ball joins us next.